Hey everyone, I actually want to talk to you about new comments from Sacha Baron Cohen, the star of Borat, the brains behind Borat. Now, he made some comments that reinforced things that he said earlier. Let me share my screen here so that you can see, but they actually speak very much to the way that Hollywood and the way that tech companies use their money and their resources to influence elections. So if you look at this, there's a new quote from Sacha Baron Cohen where he says that he's talking to NPR. He says, "I felt I had to get this movie out before the election." That's a reference to the Borat sequel. He said, we made the movie to have an impact on the election. That's a very explicit claim and a very explicit statement. And the movie reportedly had a $10 to $20 million budget. It was also backed and distributed by Amazon. So what Cohen's comments there say very clearly are that he's basically saying this movie was intended to influence the election on behalf of Joe Biden on a partisan basis. And then Amazon took it, distributed the film, and made money off of it. This is not entirely dissimilar. In fact, it's actually very similar to what Jeff Daniels said when he was talking about the Comey project, or the Comey rule, based on James Comey's memoir that came out also last fall. When Jeff Daniels heard that TV series, which was on Showtime, which is owned by Viacom, wouldn't come out before the election, he protested. He said he would refuse to do any promotion for the series because he said this series is going to matter. This is going to count. He said, again, people out there who are voting, in particular, the ones in the middle, if they exist, might see this and go, now, wait a minute. That's a quote from him in terms of the intent behind the series and the sort of like what went into this project. That had a budget reportedly of $40 million. And Viacom, again, facilitated this and profited off of it, just in the same way that Amazon facilitated and profited off of Borat 2, which, by the way, Borat, the original, is one of my favorite movies. But whenever anybody gets wrapped into these sort of like partisan missions, everything just falls flat. Saturday Night Live is a great example of this. And that's pretty much exactly what happened with the Borat sequel. It was just really, really hard to get through, like kind of cringy. But anyway, that's sort of beside the point, although it is also, there's an interesting point in there about how having that sort of partisan mission makes art terrible because it prevents you from coming at things with the necessary honesty to evaluate them in a way that, reflects on both sides honestly. It's just not going to be interesting art if you can't do that. But again, beside the point, what I will say is that it's interesting thinking about Amazon's role in all of this, given that Amazon pulled Ryan Anderson's very popular and really good book, When Harry Became Sally, which is a dive into transgenderism. It's well-sourced, it's well-researched. It's also, more importantly, very, very compassionate. I shouldn't say more importantly, but very importantly, it's a really compassionate look at the issue. And it is, again, it's very well-researched. It had been listed as a bestseller on Amazon, but it was pulled. And it's sort of like this digital book burning, right? That these tech companies are going to use all of their platforms to take away everybody's ability to read anything that dissents from far leftist dogma. And I thought actually Christina Hoff Sommers made a really good point on Twitter. I'm going to share the screen again. You can see it right there. One can buy Valerie Solanas' Scum, Society for Cutting Up Men manifesto, Ted Kaczynski's Unabomber manifesto, and Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf on Amazon, but not Ryan T. Anderson's new book critiquing the transgender movement. Please explain Amazon. We also saw Senator Marco Rubio pushing Amazon to explain what was going on with this as well, which I think is a really smart and important move. And it's sad that it would be coming only from Republicans. That's something that should come from people just across the aisle. But it goes to show how this new sort of bloated, expanded definition of bigotry that really implicates everyone who doesn't happen to be the furthest left on every single issue. Because when you step out of line once, you also get canceled. Let's not forget that. It happened to people who signed the so-called Harper's letter even glorious Steinem and Noam Chomsky caught tons of flack for putting their names to a letter that basically reaffirmed the values of free expression. And so this is all, I think, really important to think about. At the same time that Amazon is profiting off of a literal campaign contribution to Joe Biden in the form of Sacha Baron Cohen's Borat sequel, and Sacha Baron Cohen is so comfortable, like it just speaks to how the sort of like climate of Hollywood, that he's comfortable enough to just like rattle that off in multiple interviews. He said it many times since the fall. And Amazon backs it. They are sort of profiting off of and facilitating this campaign contribution, but they can't actually even tolerate the notion of hosting Ryan Anderson's book on their site. And by the way, I guarantee you they made money off that book as well. But at the same time, they haven't gone back in the past and reapplied those same standards in a fair way to, say, Ted Kaczynski or Mein Kampf or Valerie Salernos. So it's just it's disgusting. It's beyond, like, we don't have this shared concept of what constitutes actual bigotry anymore. And that's really, really hurting us. And it's also really hurting the climate for free expression. One thing that we talked about last week, when Chris Harrison was basically forced to step aside from hosting The Bachelor, which is a show he's hosted since its inception, he got canceled because he was talking about the sort of pitfalls of cancel culture. They canceled the debate on cancel culture. And we're getting to a point where we can't even have these conversations anymore without somebody getting canceled. You can't critique the dogma without being canceled. And that creates a really chilling and a really chilled environment for debate. And it further enforces the total monopoly the left has on conversation in the public square. And they are wielding the power that these massive institutions run by oligarchs at this point, these massive tech institutions run by oligarchs at this point, they're basically using that power to enforce their definitions of bigotry. And that power makes them more powerful than certain countries, and then our country as government in some context. So we're in a really dangerous situation. And I think it's important to sort of take a step back and look at how these companies are explicitly benefiting or explicitly helping Democrats, right? Like obviously Hollywood leans left. Obviously their art is often political. Art should be political. Art and politics can be a really great and beautiful combination. Partisan art is kind of different. And that's what they're doing here. So the fact that Cohen is comfortable enough to just sort of like say this in interview after interview, in Hollywood, by the way, which hates Citizens United, purports to hate Citizens United, this is only possible because of Citizens United. The only reason he's not running afoul of FEC regulations is because of Citizens United. And so they sort of like purport to have all of these different standards and beliefs, et cetera, et cetera. And what actually happens is that they're so sort of calcified because they take no criticism and no dissent. They shut down the criticism and dissent, that they become this just Frankenstein monster of bad ideas. But they're also really powerful, right? They're also really powerful because they've spent the last decade amassing intense market power. And that translates into intense cultural power. So we're, I think, in a really dangerous spot. And what we're seeing is things like, Amazon, at the same time as they're sort of pouring money into what is billed by the star and creator Borat as a campaign contribution to Joe Biden, and openly billed as such, not sort of covertly billed that way. But what we're seeing is them, doing that at the same time as they're pushing people off their platform, not explaining their standards, unevenly applying their standards. It's a mess all around. And the sad thing is, it's going to be really hard. It's going to be a really difficult hole to dig ourselves out of, because we can't have this debate like Chris Harrison tried to without also being canceled. That's why we're in this hole that's so hard to dig out of, because you can't even say, like, Chris Harrison literally asked that we extend grace to one of the contestants on The Bachelor who had previously attended an antebellum themed party and done some other things sort of similar to that. He asked for grace. And that was enough to get him canceled. He asked for grace. He said maybe we should take a pause on the cancel culture frenzy. And that was enough to get him canceled. So again, I say this not to bum you out, not to bum all of us out, but just simply to acknowledge the harsh reality that we're in a really, really, really deep hole, and we really lack the resources to dig ourselves out of it increasingly, because the resource is speech, and the powerful are using all of the power that they've amassed in big tech and in big media to shut down that debate right off the bat. We can't even have the conversation without getting canceled. And, they're increasingly using the power of their platforms, which again, in a lot of contexts are more powerful than governments. They're using that power to revoke the speech or to sort of cancel the speech or silence the speech of anybody who questions dogma. And that's just so deeply unhealthy. And it speaks to a real sickness in our culture that the people at the heights of the tech industry, in the media, are okay with this. I remember when the Harper's letter came out, and if you don't remember what that was, it was kind of signed by centrists and leftists after Tom Cotton's op-ed was retracted from the New York Times, the Send in the Troops op-ed, for allegedly putting Black New York Times staffers in danger. After the Times retracted that, the Harper's letter banded together centrists and leftists like Noam Chomsky and Gloria Steinem to say, we reaffirm the importance of free expression and its importance to debate. Well, I said at the time that'll either be a death rattle or, part of the process forward. And if anything, months later, with that in the rearview mirror for like half a year, nothing is getting better. So the fact that you have the centrist coalition of, reasonable people who believe in the importance of free expression, which is just objectively obvious, we're just beyond that point right now. And the people who refuse to acknowledge it are pulling all the levers and hold all the strings in our society for the most part. Are there some elected officials who might disagree with that? Sure, but they're not going to have the courage, I guess, except for some Republicans, to put their feet down and say, this is what's happening. So anyway, this has been my 12-minute rant on the way that Amazon and other companies like Viacom, which was behind the $40 million Comey rule, which its own star billed as an attempt to sway the election in favor of Joe Biden, are using their corporate power. It's another point of reflection for conservatives who have championed free markets, and I believe in free markets. I believe in our wonderful system, and I think it's, given people a standard of living. It's facilitated a new standard of living in a way that no other economic system or country ever has, and a better standard of living. So I believe in all of that, but I think conservatives now are, obviously, many people have said this, really grappling with that kind of interaction between markets and between values, and trying to figure out what those values are in the first place, and then figuring out how they can interact with markets. And this is another part of it. So there's corporations that have been empowered by the American system of free enterprise no longer share our values. They no longer share a consensus on what the Constitution means and what it is and what the common good is. And we're sort of coming apart, at the seams. That's what it feels like. So again, this is a long way of saying, pay attention to corporate power. They're wielding their power as they're amassing their power, as they're sort of doubling down. They're wielding it in really, really dangerous ways. So that said, please subscribe if you're here. We're going to do more live streams. We've already been doing a lot of live streams. We're putting all of our Federalist Radio Hour podcasts up here. And we just appreciate all of you subscribing and sticking around and listening. We love our audience very much. So please subscribe, and of course, stay tuned for more.